Thank you. And on behalf of us all, I think to thank Art Basel for inviting us, and Stephanie in particular for inviting us to take the stage for this. So as Stephanie said, what's the point of art criticism is a kind of very broad, open-ended subject. Like a children's experiment, could go anywhere. But I think during the course of this fair, I've had various interpretations of what art criticism is. I've had a gallerist approach me because he was shocked that a review of an exhibition wasn't exactly positive. I've had an artist approach me because he didn't think that I'd accurately interpreted his intentions rather than what he'd actually done in the exhibition. And then I had a curator approach me because they were upset that I hadn't regurgitated a press release. So I think there's many different interpretations of this subject. I work at Art Review, as Stephanie mentioned, and that is a magazine that was very much involved with John Berger, the novelist and critic, when he was alive. And he was one of the very early contributors, and he set certain terms that we followed. You know, it's been a case of sort of one idea for 70 years. But he would say that the role of the art critic was to relate art, contemporary art in particular, to the real outside ordinary world. And one of the things that involves is the basic assumption that in some ways art sits apart from the ordinary world, which is a sort of depressing and disappointing notion that you have to get over before you can really get going. And the other thing it involves is the suggestion that if a critic is successful, if a bunch of critics are successful, there'll no longer be any need for them. So it's basically a slow suicide, because once you've convinced everyone that art's part of the ordinary world, then the critic's position is completely redundant. And that's the sort of house of pain in which I work. But I thought it might be interesting to invite each of the panelists maybe to say how they first got involved in art criticism and what they were hoping to achieve by doing so. Siddhartha, do you want to? I'm just going to go in order, I'm lazy.
Okay. Good afternoon. I'm Siddhartha Mitter. I'm based in New York City. I'm a freelancer, as many of us are, most of us probably are in the field, with a hybrid practice. I think that's probably true of most of us in the field as well. I write criticism in the sense of reviews, but I more often write what I would call art journalism, reported pieces, profiles, stories about scenes, places, and contemporary art happening in those contexts, a lot of artist profiles. So even the term criticism, this is a long-standing thing, you know, what criticism, authority, I don't really like authority, including my own. So that's my own queasiness about the term. At the same time, yes, I am a critic, and I do that. I came into the field late, very much in middle age, through other kinds of culture journalism, but before that, my training was in the social sciences, in politics and economics, and I think that informs my work in the field. What did I hope to do when I came into the field? Really, I hoped to stay sane. Things in the world were depressing, deteriorating. Living in the United States, although my work is local and around the US and international, I'm based in New York. We were coming into this sort of Trump, et cetera, period. The energies were bad. He hadn't been elected yet, but the general energies were bad. And it became clear that the opportunity to go back into arts writing and to really commit fully into art writing was a way to think about civic possibility and ideas and creation, inherently with politics and social issues involved, but not in the front of a newspaper where you have to deal with the kind of abuse and degrading that was going on in the political culture. So for me, it was really a matter of staying sane and trying to put a little something into the culture. I write for a lot of different publications. I write mostly for the New York Times. That's probably where my work is most visible. I've also written for Artforum, all kinds of publications in the field. So that's what I hoped for, and it is helping me stay sane. It's not making me rich. I'm extremely poor, but that's also the way it works in the field. But I at least get to deal with creative people and think about ideas and think about beauty and think about form and think about civic possibility every day. And anything I work on involves me learning something, studying something, and learning something, and I'm grateful for that.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jareh. I'm a curator, researcher, writer. I live in London, and I also spend quite a bit of time in Lagos, Nigeria, as well. I guess the beginnings of my writing criticism career started off when I was an art history student, but outside of sort of the assignments and the sort of theoretical requirements of writing, I started more at journalism. I used to write for the student paper, reviewing like gigs actually, and not anything to do with art. And then I moved to London in the early 2000s, and I began a blog, really, just sort of documenting a lot of what was happening around East London, where I lived, artist performances. So really just like picture on my phone and my thoughts about it. The blog is still there. I'm like probably quite embarrassed to look back now. There's probably a lot of typos and grammatical errors, but it was also something that I was doing that would get me out seeing things in the local context of where I lived. And at the time as well, I was struggling a bit to write for publication. So I had this art history degree from, what was a quite good university at the time. But when I pitch ideas to editors, I didn't have any experience, and they just ignore me. So I was like, right, I'm going to do my own thing. I'm going to have this blog, and then by some sort of accident, some people came across the blog, and then I got invited to write for free. And because I also have a curatorial practice, I went on to study a master's degree in curating, and then these conversations around, well, certainly engaging with art criticism came more into my landscape. And because, as a curator, writing comes alongside it. You're trying to sort of think through ideas in the exhibition, through proposals, through the exhibition interpretation. I then began to be interested in specifically reviews and also artist interviews. So that became a sort of basis that sat alongside the curatorial. And over 10 years, I found that when the curatorial projects and jobs weren't happening, I moved more into writing, which, I've written all sorts of different things, from reviews to critical think pieces, studying more, going into academic writing. So this idea of sort of, I don't even know if I'm an art critic, because the kinds of writing I've done have evolved as I've done different things, as I've moved to different places, as I've thought more about who has access to contemporary art and what kinds of audiences engage with different forms of writing. So I've responded to that in different ways over the last decade. What did I hope to achieve from the writing or this engagement with art criticism? I guess at some point in the sort of into 2007, 2008, for me, I became a bit disillusioned with a lot of the specifically art publications that I was engaging with as somebody who was in the field, but I wasn't even getting a comprehension or an understanding for some of what I was reading. I felt like some of the language was inaccessible and just sort of, even for me. So I was just really thinking about the different types of voices that speak for this field of art criticism, and what would it mean for someone who, I didn't come from I mean, I did study art history, but prior to that, I was a purely science background. I'm from Nigeria. I didn't grow up going to museums, and I sort of entered the field through arts education, essentially. And what would that sort of, having these two parallel lives and experiences between Nigeria and the UK mean for the kinds of way I'm engaging with the field? So I was just very interested in this idea of what the different forms of writing do and who are the audiences they speak to. And this is something that I constantly think about. If I'm writing about African and African diaspora artists for Western publications, what does that mean for somebody coming across that who perhaps doesn't have access to some of the language I'm using? How can my writing be situated in the context of where I'm from and moving between two different spaces, between the West and between Nigeria? So these are things that I'm constantly thinking about. But really, it's a question about, it's always a critical question around how can I get this writing across different audiences? So I don't have I write for Freeze, I write for The Culture Trip, I write for Wallpaper, I write for architecture magazines. I want the writing to move across different publications, online, in print, because I really desire that the artists that I write about get different access to different audiences through different publications.
I guess while we're there, it'd be interesting to know, do you write differently for those different publications?
I do, and it's a struggle because I feel that on the one hand, sometimes I have this really, I guess it also comes with the length of the publication. So there's short form writing, 300 words that I have to sort of get things in 300 words. And then, there's a academic journal where I have to then sort of get into this sort of formal way of writing and referencing and thinking, and it's been a challenge actually, but it's also been a challenge through the different stages of education. I mean, I did a PhD at a stage where it just sort of happened, and then I had to sort of think that way and write that way, and then when that ended, it became really difficult to sort of switch the writing back to something that was more accessible, actually, even though I'm sure my thesis is the most accessible thesis in the history of anybody who's done a PhD. But it's interesting moving through and responding to these different publications and these different ways of writing and the different voices. But I'm up for it. I'm also interested in the challenge of, as I said, this centrality of access, and it's. I feel that good writing can exist in different types of publications, and that's what I'm trying to do.
Good afternoon. I'm Keith Wallace, and I'm based in Vancouver, Canada. I come from a curatorial background and not an art criticism background as such, so most of my writing has been what I would call critical writing, and it's a sort of art criticism and critical writing are two different things, but I think they're starting to cross over more at this point. So in terms of art criticism, it's really come through other writers. I've been the editor-in-chief of, I was editor-in-chief of Yishu, Journal of Contemporary Chinese Art, from 2004 to 2020, so it was 17 years, and have gone through about 1,500 essays that I've edited. The publication has done like articles on artists and exhibitions and symposia, etc., but also reviews, which is where a lot of the art criticism comes in. I have written reviews myself, but I really haven't felt very comfortable sort of thinking about myself doing art criticism as such. So I really feel like going through these 17 years and thinking about what art criticism is, I think there is a shift that has happened for me, in any case, in terms of art criticism being something like an argument or a judgment, and having somebody's judgment being the authoritative word about whether something is good or bad or of value or not. And that's not really interesting to me. I really like to see art criticism as being a part of a discourse, as part of a dialogue, as something that is ongoing, and that the writer is making a contribution to a discussion about an artist or an exhibition, and it's a discussion that will be ongoing and won't end, actually. And I don't believe in kind of resolution. I think that things just go on and on and on. Time passes, history goes on. We look at things differently from historical perspectives. So I think the idea of art criticism, people think that, and many writers actually that I've come across feel that they have to criticize, and that sort of has this negative connotation to it. And I don't think that criticizing is necessarily helpful. I think that more of a kind of analytical perspective, contextualizing the work in terms of other work, in terms of where it's placed in history, in terms of the artist's other work, etc., is of much more value and will be of value historically in terms of research and people going back and looking at art criticism, critical writing, and the value that it provides. Because, I mean, a lot of reviews, especially really short reviews, I mean, they don't often, you know, they're of the moment, but they don't really have lasting value, in a sense, in terms of research. So part of the approach of Yishu, even though we've done historical essays and we've done contemporary essays of the moment, but we've always sort of thought about it as being about the future, and that these texts that have been presented will be of value in the future for research and posterity. And we actually issue suspended publication in 2021. We may come back in one form or another, I don't know. But we do have an online archive of these 1,500 essays, and it does get used, and that's kind of our function at this point. We have people accessing the archive every week, and so that's where we are now, and we'll probably get into further discussion about what art criticism is.
For sure. Did you, Shanta?
Hello, everyone. First, I'd like to thank Basel and Stephanie for bringing us here, and thanks to everyone for coming today. My name is Du Keke. I'm the editor of artforum.com.cn, the Chinese language website of Artforum. Since our website is really a product of translation between cultures and languages, so I would like to think art writing or art criticism functions like similarly to translation. That is, like our editor Elizabeth Chamberlain wrote in her essay for Artforum's 60th anniversary issue this past September, is to instruct you in not being at home in your own home. Maybe I'll come back to that later when we discuss, but first I'd like to say a few words about our website, because I guess most of you already know a lot about Artforum, the magazine, but not so familiar with its Chinese website. So I'd like to start by giving you a very brief introduction of our website, how it was founded and what we do every day. Artforum.com.cn was launched in the year 2007. It was a decision made by Artforum's publisher, Charles Guarino. I think some of us may know him quite well. It's his decision to start the website, and Philip Chinari, now the director of UCCA Contemporary Art Center in Beijing, is our founding editor. And the beginning, most of our contents were translated from the magazine and its English website. I myself started working for Artforum China as a translator, and I'm still doing a lot of its translation today. But gradually, we began to commission writers on our own, publishing short reviews and reports in Chinese about exhibitions and events happening in Beijing, Shanghai, Hong Kong, Taipei, or other major cities in the Greater China region. Now I think we basically have the same columns that the English site do, like book reviews, film reviews, land diaries, etc., etc. We also do features around different topics that we think are important to the Chinese readers twice or once a year. In 2017, we published a Chinese language anthology of some of the most historical texts published in Artforum magazine. But I can talk about that later. I think you can imagine us as a ghost in a shell. Yeah, the framework, with all its journalistic principles, its rigorous division between advertising and editorial contents, and also its writer-oriented approach, actually comes from the magazine. It's like a pre-existing shell, and all the contents we produce in Chinese go into that shell and grow within its parameter. There have been some trial and error in the past decade, but I think now we have developed a ghost that really grows into the shell and at the same time works, I think, quite effectively in the Chinese language art media environment.
Thank you. Well, it seems like there's a whole can of worms between all of you. So I think maybe slightly randomly, I'm going to pick up on this division between criticism and art writing, and also the question that you raised about the issue of authority, because my experience is that the critic doesn't inherently have authority. It's the audience that gives the critic authority, that there's a belief involved in that. And I wonder what you all think about that.
I mean, there's the writer and there's the audience, but there's also the platform in between them. I write mostly for the New York Times. When I write for the New York Times, there's a certain kind of weight that comes with it. Oh, the New York Times said this, the New York Times said that. Artforum has a very strong authority of its own kind. Art Review does too. I echo very much what Jareh was saying about the value of working and writing across different outlets and different voices. I absolutely work in a different voice depending on the platform, 100%. But I think that if you're being published and if you're being distributed in an outlet where it's widely seen or where it carries a certain prestige in the field, you have to deal with the problem of authority. It's actually something you have to deal with. That the fact that whether you think that you have it or not, you will be invested with it, or there are consequences to what you write. I think that for me, kind of the theory of the case, I think that I've formed organically is that the point of the work is service. I think this is service work, right? We are in service, and I think that what are we in service to? The way I think of it is that we're in service to three different kinds of service. This is my theory, or at least how I have come to think of my own work. One point of service is to artists, to the people whose work we are engaging with and writing about. That's artists, it's also curators, it's arts workers in a broader sense. It might be the people who organize exhibitions, it might be the people who have third spaces, artist-run things, et cetera, but to the actual humans who are doing this work. If I'm going to interview you, or if I'm not interviewing you, but I'm writing about your exhibition, right, reporter, critic, either way, I want that to be of interest to you. I want you to feel that you were engaged with, and that you weren't getting, the same old questions that have been recycled. When I write about somebody in depth, a profile, I always read what other people have written about them. Not because I want to see what was good and what was bad and what was done before. It's like, no, what is the state of discourse around this practice so that we can move it forward? So I think that's service number one. Service number two is to the public, like the wide, broad public. Again, there are different expectations for different platforms, but when I write for a daily newspaper, a general audience daily newspaper, especially a very widely read one, I want the work to be inviting to anybody who happens to turn that page and see that article, or who happens to scroll down and see something. You can't make them stay, right? You can't force somebody to stay for your entire article, but you can certainly make the first few paragraphs inviting so that somebody who's a total novice might become interested. And this has to do with the publics, right? As you were saying, Jareh, this has to do with the audience expanding, always broadening the public. And then the third point of service, I think, is to the record, to the archive, to the body of knowledge. And this is very much in line with what Keith was saying. It's not about writing, and this is a point you were making when we were chatting just before, it's not about writing the definitive assessment or the definitive profile or the definitive review or assessment of any theme. But it's certainly about progressing the state of the art so that the next person who comes in and writes about it can refer to what you did, and it's useful to them in continuing to build the field that way. So for me, thinking about it as service, or whatever that kind of framework is that I'm proposing, obviously think of it as a triangle, right? With those three priorities, depending on the assignment and the amount of time you have and who you're doing it for and blah blah blah, you might be pushing more towards one or the other point of the triangle. But that's kind of the way of thinking about the work, I think. And so for me, that sort of does away with this question of reporting, writing, criticism, and even the question of authority kind of dissipates, I think, when you think about it that way.
I just want to make a few comments about the idea of authority. And many people in the art world feel that writers who write art criticisms are authoritative about what it is that they're writing, and that they stand as an authority. And I think that in a sense they are, because they have the platform there to express themselves. But what I've become very interested in is whether one is writing from an authoritative stance, or whether one is writing through doubt. And what I mean by writing through doubt is that one is not writing and what I say is right, but writing in terms of always questioning oneself. And I've just moved into, not recently, but in the last few years, moved into a zone of writing where I write through doubt. And I'm always questioning myself and everything that I'm writing down. It's like, really? Is this, is this right or whatever? Is this making sense? And just always being there and questioning myself and writing through doubt. And in that way, I see writing being more propositional, that a writer is making a proposition. And again, it's sort of going back to that adding to a discourse or a dialogue, and that what they're writing about isn't necessarily definitive.
Sorry, I'll just jump in on this. I think the point you make about the audience and the critic and this idea of elevation and authority, that's something that I've been thinking about when, you know, I mean, for me personally, I've gone from this journey of sort of writing on a blog, and then I'm writing for certain platforms and I'm writing about certain topics that I feel are contributing to a discourse or a historicization or a revision of a history that hasn't, or overlooked or hasn't been written before. And then there's this sort of shift that happens where, you know, it's not something that I've necessarily anticipated, where you begin to be seen as a voice for something which, you know, I'm coming at it from the perspective of this needs to be written, but it doesn't end here, right? And then all of a sudden, it's like you're the authority voice on ceramics. It's like, I'm not. I told a particular, or I wrote about a particular thing that had been overlooked, but then the reception of the piece, or, you know, whatever, because of the audience and because of the platform as well, shifts that really. So I always have this discomfort with that. And also you see it with certain critics where, you know, whatever they say about a particular thing, a topic or a theme becomes the definitive or the sort of standard from which, or even in some cases just is, you know, sort of sets the standard for a context that could be more broader. And you know, what Keith was saying about writing always evolving and time always evolving around this subject of criticism, I think is really crucial. But then this audience, critic, writing, text in itself, the way it shifts between the two can be, you know, something completely out of everyone's control, really.
I mean, maybe to speak to some of that, I realized I didn't share how I started. And I started because someone confused me with someone else and asked me to write something that the other person was an expert on. And then someone else read that piece and thought I was an expert on that subject and asked me to do another one. So it all started in kind of doubt. And I was in a panel quite recently where someone quoted something at me and just stared at me. And I was like, what? And they were like, you wrote that 15 years ago. And I was like, well, I wouldn't have written it now. And I think even on a personal level, there's evolution, you know, because you can write a review that's maybe not complimentary about a show, but that's one show, and the same artist you might write about later on, and they've done something amazing. And I think one of the interesting things of the field we're in is that you can change opinions, and you can publicly change opinions and demonstrate the way the conversation between people and artworks, and people, for that matter, also evolves. But I was wondering, Jareh, when you were talking about working with curating, writing on various different levels, is your relationship with the subject, whether it's an artist or an artwork, different in each of those? So as a curator, you're supportive in a different way, in a kind of caring way. And you might not be quite in that mode with the artist as a writer. I mean, so I'm partly German, and if I was being really German about it, I would say that no curators can be critics, right? That there's a line, and you're already invested in a different way with an artist as a curator than you would be as someone, let's say, impartially writing about it. And I guess, Keith, as well, it's for you too on this, if you think there's different...
I'm just trying to... I mean, I've not written any criticism around anything I've curated, because...
I meant the artist you've shown.
Oh, the artists I've shown. If I've written about them outside of...
Change your relationship in a way that would make certain types of writing less possible.
I'm just sort of scanning. I mean, they're just different hats that I have to wear, and I don't think that absolutely the curatorial is about care. It is about sort of realizing a vision for an exhibition tied into a whole narrative around the artist's career, and the writing is, or the sort of criticism around their work is completely separate. I think both can work. I don't agree that curators can't come into the field of criticism. I think it can be an uncomfortable position, but I do think that it can sort of like move across both, actually. But I'm just trying to think specifically if I've had it. I think I do keep them quite separate, actually. It's not really come into my mind a situation where I was engaging with both with the same artist, or perhaps it's come like years later, actually. So it hasn't been conflicting for me, actually, at all, if that answers your question.
Didi, of all of us, you're the only one who works pretty much exclusively on an online platform. And I think it might be interesting to talk about these different delivery systems, because even as Siddhartha mentioned, the record being one of his tripod legs, the internet exists in a different state in terms of the record. So that if I'm teaching a student and they quote from online, they have to time it, date it, and recheck the URL frequently. But I wonder how it works for you differently, perhaps, on a website.
Yes, but I don't think the platform is the most, like the most frequently question that I think about. Because Keith is talking about writing through doubt, and I agree with you a lot on that. And I also remember that in a panel discussion organized by October magazine around 2002 or 3, they talked about the definition of criticism either as a judgment on the quality of an artwork or whether an object falls into the category of artworks. But also on the same panel, I remember artist Andre Fraser said something about site-specific criticism that I find really useful to me. And she says, and I quote, "Thinking site-specifically means writing for an audience or readership in an active way." I think that's the most important I think about very frequently. It's just that we want to, for artforum.com.cn, we really want to develop and nurture the kind of art criticism that not only interprets or make critical arguments about an artwork or art projects, but also pays close attention to the specific context that you're working in as an art critic. In other words, it means that when you write, you have to constantly think about who's your audience and what's the specific social and cultural situation you're working in. But for us, it doesn't mean that we want to emphasize on any irreducible cultural difference, or we want to have separate criteria for reading or evaluating Chinese contemporary art. And of course, it's another point to debate whether there is such a thing called Chinese contemporary art or contemporary Chinese art. But anyway, it does not mean that you have to have certain kind of specialized knowledge about China or Chinese society in order to do criticism in Chinese, whether online or for print. What it means is just that every time when we make a general statement, like art criticism in crisis, we have to really test its truth by putting it into the social and historical and cultural situation we're living and working in, and see if it stands. Why I say this is because, for example, a lot of discussion in the West about the crisis of art criticism are actually premised on the fact or existence of a public, like Siddhartha just mentioned, a public or a public sphere. If we want to quote Habermas, to and for which the critic speaks. And then the subsequent erosion of this public space by the force of a globalized market, Basel being the paramount symbol of that, or by the force of capital, by mass communications or social media platform, attention economy, etc., etc. That idea of public or a public sphere is closely related to the liberal conception of private individuals coming together to discuss their common affairs. But in China, as in any other developing countries that have gone through very rapid nation building and modernizing process in a very short time span, it's obvious we can't take it for granted that such a public or public sphere has ever existed. Instead, for example, in China, we had this failed attempt to throw all the individualists, that is intellectuals mainly, including artists and writers, into the crucible of people's revolution to re-educate the cultural elites so that they can really be united with the mass. But that failed attempt ended up in traumatizing a whole generation. But talking about that would be another, a digression from what we're talking about today. Anyway, what I want to say is just that there is not much sense of a loss in terms of power of criticism, like the authority of criticism, for us here, or for me at least, because you can't really get emotional about losing something that you never had in the first place. So I think art criticism still has a lot of work to do in the Chinese context, and one of them is maybe to build a public from within, to develop a public sphere together with the artists, curators, educators, and all the people working in other sectors of the art community. And for that, I think, again, maybe thinking site-specifically is really crucial to me. I think I'll stop here, sorry.
I think you raised kind of a really crucial and interesting point there about site specificity. And a lot of what we collectively do is bringing specific sites and contexts into a much broader public sphere. And I wonder what are some of the challenges of doing that. You talked about how you write in different ways in different publications, but it also means in different situations or contexts, you're going to have to do translating, which is kind of the fundamental, for me, the kind of critical issue of writing about art, is to how much translating you do and when you refuse to do that. So I wonder how you deal with that.
Yeah. It depends on, again, who you're writing for and who has to look at your work and intervene on it before it reaches the public, right? So it's the question of the editor or the editors. Yeah, sometimes you have to refuse. Sometimes when your editors are upper middle class, white, liberal people in New York City who talk about, well, our readership won't understand what this means. You have to push against that. But there's usually not time to have a whole debate about it. What do you mean by our readers? What do you mean I won't understand? What do you mean? And there certainly is no time to get into the theory of it and to drop Edouard Glissant on them and opacity and all of that. You just have to, you're on deadline and you just have to, you have to work it. And you have to be tactical about it. You have to choose which battles to fight. You have to concede on some things and be intransigent on others. And most importantly, you can't just refuse, because generally the person who may be putting a really annoying point to you that is extremely problematic might also be a person who has very advanced editorial skills and knows how a piece works and doesn't work, and you need to be open and receptive to that side of it, whilst at the same time holding your ground on the other part of it. So there's that. Again, ultimately, just think about the public. Think about getting something out there into the public sphere, into the culture, and doing work that you feel reflects your own dignity. Again, in the understanding that you might have an entirely, just as you were saying, you might have an entirely different view years later, but that's normal because years pass, and that's entirely a normal thing. About site specificity, look, art is happening, right? In authoritarian countries, art is happening. Through a pandemic, art is happening. In hypercapitalism, art is happening. Art turns out to be happening constantly. And we probably shouldn't be surprised by that, because no matter what's going on, no matter what traumas are going through a society, no matter what problems, no matter what transitions, it turns out that the arts in general are places where that information, those experiences are being processed, internalized, reflected, and new possibility is being imagined. Civic possibility, social possibility. And art doesn't have to be political to have that sense of possibility. It can actually be entirely decorative. You can put something, just a pretty landscape or in front of somebody, and then just seeing it is going to trigger something about new ways of thinking about who knows what else. It might, for them, it might have some association with something that we couldn't anticipate. That's the mystery of it, and that's the beauty of it. So the work is happening, and I think that it's our job as intermediaries or translators or people who are kind of building the archive to be of service to the impulse that is producing that work on the part of the artist, and around them, the exhibition maker and the curator and so forth, and the impulse that is receiving it in the public.
But I think along the way, a lot of the terms we're using are so unstable and different in different parts of the world. So for example, I inherited from my grandmother in Sri Lanka a kind of collection of a painting of avatars, not painting, it's a print of avatars. When everyone comes to the apartment and sees it, they go like, who made that great work of art? And I'm like, well, it's either wallpaper or a calendar, but I can't work out which it is. And it's my grandmother cut it out, and she used to have it by her bed, and it has a sentimental meaning to me, but it's not a work of art in the sense that you mean it. And then they'll go, oh, great, a found object, you know.
Yeah.
And
at a certain point, you just have to let it go. You know, just like hashtag keep it moving.
But I think the terms we're using are inherently unstable, and things become art because they look exotic. Sometimes they don't fit into someone's normal routine or reality. And I think if we're working in different territories, we have to understand that these things move and have different meanings in different places. And when they're stripped of context, like here, they're going to mean something different when they're in that context. And I think that sensibility as a critic, or as a writer, I find quite hard to deal with. Like how you convey it. I mean, you've talked about it, you do it in all your work, really, to kind of take not just the art, but the context and where it came from, because, you know, nothing comes from nothing. And I wonder how much of what you do relates to bringing that context and everything that surrounds the work of art, along with the work of art.
So I had a moment in, just before the pandemic in 2019, where I got to a stage where I'd been encountering, I mean, just, you know, because of my background, I was drawn to certain artists, specifically artists in Nigeria and then across West Africa, but then encountering their work in the West. So at biennials and all of these like fancy things, when there's like a big retrospective show somewhere. And we were just having a conversation, and I was saying to Siddhartha that at that stage, I'd never traveled across West Africa. And so through these years of developing all sorts of different forms of writing, I also began to think of this question of context in relation to the work and the writing I was doing. I mean, I've been mostly independent for a long time. Traveling across the continent, it's, you know, something that, I mean, even traveling across the region, it's something that I had to, first of all, wait to get research funding to do that. Because, and so when it finally happened, and I started sort of visiting artists that I'd written about years prior within context of places that I know were integral to their work, I felt very differently about the writing that I'd done prior, because there's only so much of reading context through somebody else's words or somebody else's voice that you can then sort of, you know, it's research into the work you're doing, but it's not you going and being in certain spaces yourself. And they're always changing and they're always shifting. But, you know, it's, you know, and so for me, it just even, you know, and it also sort of like, I also sort of think about when I go to places and review things like biennials and I'm there for a couple of days and I'm sort of like trying to get a grasp of the space as it is now, as I'm witnessing it, and the expectations that I had prior to coming and coming over. So it's a sort of constant, I guess it also speaks to this idea of writing from a place of doubt and just paying attention to, and then it's also this refusal also of, there's certain things that I just, you know, I just can't give an all-encompassing opinion. So then, you know, I need to step away from whatever the assignment is. But, I mean, ultimately, you know, really trying to sort of, I guess, have a more holistic is the word, research approach that informs writing in a more sort of direct way. That's kind of where I'm at.
Can I just offer one other thing on that? I mean, I think it's a matter of having a certain ethic, but also trusting your curiosity, right? I'm not going to parachute in some place that I've never been and immediately start writing about it. People have asked me, I'm staying here for a few days after this, and people ask me, oh, are you going to cover anything? You're ready to write? I'm not writing about anything. I'm here to look. I haven't been here in decades. I'm here to actually look and see things and think. On the other hand, it may very well be that after an immersion here for these coming, you know, for the coming week and the experience already in the last few days, maybe I'll come back 6 months from now or a year from now and actually be ready to write about something. Because you also have to trust yourself. And you have to trust your curiosity and trust that at a certain point you have experience and you are bringing the reader along on that journey of curiosity.
But maybe that also raises a question of velocity, and in terms of the media velocity right now. So I think with a print publication beforehand, it was really irrelevant whether the show was on or not when the review occurred. And there was a space in which to think about it and reflect on it. And I think in a lot of platforms now, there's a pressure, if you review a show, that the review should come out while the show's still on, because there's some need for the review to drive audiences. And this, with social media, even faster. Is that something you think of as a problem or a pressure, and that's sort of restricting considered thinking about things? Did
Not really, because our reviews are always short, so it doesn't take that much time for us to turn out the reviews. And also, I'm not worried about it becomes like a promotion for the exhibitions or the artists. Like I said before, what I think most about is like What I like about my work is like the communication we have with our writers, and you get to observe how they think about things and how they organize their languages about what they have seen, and you can see that from that, and it's kind of like the material for your self-reflection. I'll give you an example. A lot of our writers in China, especially the young writers, when they write an exhibition review, they always exhibit this unwillingness to really spend time on describing the work or the exhibition. They would often write a few lines about the works and then sort of jump very quickly into some kind of serialization of the work or the show. So the whole text reads like stamping theoretical stamps on things, on exhibitions, on artworks. That's really something bothers me a lot for a long time. And I think that may not be a unique phenomenon for the Chinese language.
Certainly isn't.
But I do think that really makes me think that maybe this has something to do with the cultural and historical circumstances in China, because I felt this really strongly during the pandemic. For the past 3 years, I was in mainland China. Under the zero COVID policy, we have really witnessed an astonishing level of the abstraction or the hollowing out of language. Like, there are a huge number of newly coined words emerging from the government's often ad hoc anti-COVID measures, and they look like they have existed for many years, and they wield huge power over people's lives. If I see these words in Chinese, I think anyone who has spent last 2 or 3 years in mainland China would immediately recall the sheer emptiness or the enormous presence of these words, these 3, often 4-character words, idioms, over people's life, like 动态清零, 静态管理. It's really scary. And maybe it's a little bit stretchy. I stretch it too far, or it's too great a jump to jump from the problems of art writing to this. But both kept me thinking a lot about, like, I'm wondering if this is something inherent in the Chinese language. Because, you know, the Chinese writing system is highly abstract. They're literally, in a sense, painted words. Or is this something that has to do with our lack of reflection on the recent revolutionary past, when a similar abstraction or generation of language went to an extreme of rigidifying into repressive dogma? I don't have an answer, but I've been thinking about this a lot. And yeah.
I mean, I think it's a really great point, and it's interesting that you began with art criticism there, because I think a lot of the issues with art writing, art criticism have been the invention of jargon, shorthand, meaningless words, invented words. I mean, there was certainly a definite time at the end of the 90s when everyone had to invent a new movement, and movements were coming around every 30 days with new names, new philosophers behind them. And I wonder, I mean, if that's had a longer term impact on art writing, that in a way there's a lot of clearing out to be done of this sort of incomprehensible stuff. I don't know if any of you have any thoughts on that. Maybe it affects specialist magazines more.
I mean, I was speaking a bit about this sort of move from different platforms, and it was particularly because of that, because it got to a stage where I felt, I'm part of this world, but a lot of this isn't making sense to me. So part of the motivation to sort of take up the writing was, as I said, how can I speak across different voices and platforms? Because if I'm in the field and I'm reading this like review or opinion piece and I don't even understand what's going on, what is somebody else who, out of curiosity has encountered an artwork or an artist, and then they're sort of trying to find out more, and then they're faced with these barriers, of language that is incomprehensible, let alone like translating that into another language. And just to sort of come back to your question around, my understanding of the question around this idea of, what was your question? It was around?
About velocity or speed?
About speech.
Yeah.
And, I just sort of think, the question was around sort of...
Speed and...
Yeah, and the sort of online platforms for publishing.
And the pressure to be quick.
Exactly, and this thing around immediacy and timeline and pegging exhibitions to, you have to do the thing when the thing is on, which if the whole thing is around sort of historicizing or contributing to a discourse, and something is important to a moment, why isn't it being historicized anyway? Why does it have to sort of be in sync with a particular time frame? We know that there's a whole exhibition history, for example, that has existed, but people make books about it, So why then does this review and this thing have to sort of align with, it needs to sort of go in when the show's on, it needs to sort of be pegged into social media, we need to hashtag it is contributing to a wider discourse around an artist's practice. So I often sort of like struggle with that actually. And just sort of this thing around the writing being fixed to like 4 to 6 weeks, or I don't know, like a whole biennial. And then that's when it's relevant, when it's part of something much larger, and different generations are going to come to things, and people arrive at things at different times. So why is there this sort of rigidity in when the writing has to happen? Especially on the internet as well, where it's timeless in a sense, but obviously needs to be archived and stuff properly.
But ideally, all these things are happening at once, right? Ideally, there are lots of us doing this work, which is not necessarily the case. Ideally, there are lots of us doing this work from multiple perspectives, being paid a dignity wage for our work. And so at a certain point, you might be writing the instant review, you might be writing the 300-word piece, you might be writing a catalog essay for a museum, you might be doing a monograph much later, you might be looking at exhibitional history. And if you're doing one of those things, somebody else is doing the other thing. And it's actually, writing is a very individual practice, right? But it's actually collective work. I wonder if people in the audience have thoughts here.
Maybe we should have that leg of the tripod. If there are any questions from the audience, do raise your hand, and if you wait for a microphone.
Hi. So my question is, I liked the concept of writing through doubt, but what I'm also concerned about is, as a reader who is trying to learn more about art, who consults alt publications, that makes me think, wait, so you guys don't know either? And I wonder if everyone is always backing off and saying, whoa, just because I wrote one thing about one artist doesn't mean I'm an expert. So, okay, then I'll do it too. If we're all just going to say what we don't know, then great. Everybody says what they don't know. At some point, it's like, why you? Why are you writing this particular piece?
Writing through doubt, it doesn't mean that you don't know. I mean, people, I've worked with Yishu for 17 years, and so people say, oh, you must be an expert on contemporary Chinese art. And I'm really uncomfortable with being an expert, because what I find is the more I know, the more I don't know. And writing through doubt, for me, is just like constantly questioning yourself rather than writing as an authority, like, I do know, and this is the right way, or the the right way to think about something when it's only my way to think about something. So writing through doubt doesn't mean that you don't know anything. I mean, I have a lot of information. I know a lot, but there's a lot I don't know. And writing through doubt means that you want to keep learning and that you have a curiosity and that you are not the authority on something because somebody else is going to have another opinion. And that you have to respect that. And that's all a part of what I see as being an ongoing discourse and a dialogue. And so we're all contributing to something, but I don't have the answer. I have a proposition.
There's one at the back.
Hello, thank you for this incredibly stimulating conversation. My name is Natska, and I own the first international gallery in Mongolia. And we are pioneering everything there, to be honest. And one of the very big conversations we have with galleries as well as artists in Mongolia, that there is no such thing as art criticism that actually exists. And curating is also just beginning now. And so as our gallery, Islam Gallery, we are actually pioneering everything from scratch. And to us, of course, we are learning in the process and there are many challenges. How would you advise or perceive in writing, approaching with such a market where everything is just starting?
I think this is great. First of all, it's wonderful that you're doing this work. You know, I would suggest, you know, commission your own writing, right? Commission writers, mix it up. Commission local writers, commission writers from elsewhere, bring writers from elsewhere to work with local writers, workshops. You can bring people in to do studio visits, to meet artists, interview. You know, comes to mind. There's a maybe random example or not. There was a few years ago, the South African gallery Stevenson had a series where they would do these little booklets where they would have quite serious interviews with maybe like eight or nine of their artists in each booklet, and then you know you could get that and you could sell it for not too much money. Things like that. Just bring the voices out there, and you have to spark it yourself, right? At a certain point, if we're waiting for editors wherever they are in New York or London or Hong Kong or wherever they might be to find the right moment and be like, oh, and then travel budget, oh, you know, who's going to go to Mongolia, all that kind of thing. You have to spark it yourself. And at a certain point, we, the field, whoever we are, from any of these perspectives, institutional, commercial, media, et cetera, we have to make our own media.
I think I'd added to that, a little bit, just to say that I think part of it's making it financially viable for a writer locally to write about art. And I think that's one of the big problems, is that you can do it once, that's fine, but unless you have a way that people can continue doing this over an extended period of time and dedicate themselves to doing it, then it becomes tricky. You're just dealing with these one-off encounters.
I would look at it from a kind of practical point of view. Writing is not easy, and to sort of think that you're just going to start to write, I think is impractical in a sense. And maybe an approach would be to start out with just having group discussions where people can talk and talk freely, and then maybe turn that talk into writing projects. So you can take the discussion and turn it into writing projects. Because when we're writing, we often talk about having a voice and that you're voicing something. So if you start out with actually literally voicing something, that maybe you can turn that into writing.
Yeah, I want to respond to the first question about if you guys can write about art, why can't I write about art? That's actually happening right now because everybody is an art critic on the social media platform. But I in preparing for the talk, I remember Mark proposed a question about art writing or art criticism. It is a discipline in or and of itself. I don't think art criticism has to be a discipline in and of itself, but I do think you need to be to a certain degree disciplined. Like I have talked about the problems I discovered when communicating with the Chinese with our Chinese writers. I think that is also why art criticism or criticism in general can play has an important role to play in the Chinese context. That is to really offer new ways of thinking or a fresh perspective to look at things and say things. It's just, like I said in the beginning, that I think the function of art criticism is really prevent you from feeling too at home in your own home, that to ensure that you're never too comfortable with yourself in your own home. Yeah.
Hi, I want to thank all the speakers. I learned a lot. I have two questions. So the first question is that the public always has a passion for shock experience. And Blair said that beauty is what is exotic. And I've definitely seen that trend more and more now in all the exhibitions I see. And I was wondering, what are your sort of engage or interpretation of this, and whether this tendency to seek shock experience is reducing the aesthetic experience, and how can we counter that trend? And the second question is, whenever there's whenever countries go through rapid growth, there will be new rich. And I came across this quote by Oscar Wilde the other day. It's like, he says, when bankers get together, they talk about art. When artists get together, they talk about money. I think that's very true. When the buyers and appreciators of art are those with money, and I had 1 minute to formulate my question, but I think I want to ask, when there is the ability to buy art, but not necessarily, I don't want to sound judgmental, the ability to appreciate art, how does art criticism work as sort of a platform that holds all these tension? Yeah, thank you.
I mean, maybe what you're saying is that, I guess within art, there's different ways of valuing something. Money is one of them, but it's not the only one of them. There can be ones that we've discussed that contribute to civic or public discourse. There can be ones that give voice to people who don't have a voice. There can be many, many ways of establishing what the value is art is other than money. And I think between us, we probably have slightly different ideas, but maybe the same ideas often, of how we should value art in our own writing individually or as in periodicals or newspapers. I don't know if you want to...
I'd offer just very quickly that there's so much art and art practice out there, and there are so few outlets or spaces where it's getting written about, that at a certain point you're just making choices. I don't usually waste time and effort writing about something that I don't like. There's much more to be done writing about something that I like or that in some way I find interesting, right? There's a lot of art that I find extremely interesting that I wouldn't necessarily put on my wall, but I find that something interesting is happening there. So if you just focus on what's interesting, you just ignore all that other stuff.
I'm probably going to blur the questions together, but I think it's a really interesting question you bring up in the context of also having this kind of conversation in the context of where we are in this sort of, super established art fair, which, you can't get away from sort of the markets and also what that brings to artists' visibility, focused on certain kinds of art, certain kinds of artistic practices, certain kinds of things that come into the context of showing and exhibiting in a space like an art fair. And also when I've not written a lot on the context of art fairs, but there are certain times when I've been invited to speak about or speak on or comment on a particular group of artists and the focus of them in fairs. So for example, about a decade ago, there was a focus on West Africa in Dubai, where not-for-profit organizations that have been doing really sort of groundbreaking work, introducing things like criticism, archiving, and those kinds of things that the lady from Mongolia was trying to address, curating in a context where curating doesn't exist within art schools. It's, a lot of the art school, the education system is still based on a British colonial system. Those things don't exist. And then individuals and these spaces are introducing this discourse through workshops, through conversations around writing, through things like conversations around how you curate and how you make exhibitions. But then that's transferred into this context of a global art market. We need to sort of there's a boom in an interest in a region, and then it comes into this conversation of being collectible, right? And being valued or seen as the next thing to invest in. And how do you write about something you're invested in, when it's pulled into this context of commerce, which exists and transforms the trajectory of artists and their careers? So it's, I think the criticism should come into that space, actually, because it is going to sort of shift the way, even within the context that the work exists, the way that within the local context, how people value and see artists on the international platform. And there should be an interrogation of that, actually, and how that shifts over time. Random thought.
I would just simply say that most writers I know may write about the market, but they don't write for the market.
There's a question at the front, the gentleman here. On the right. This one on the right.
Hi, I'm just curious to know, what is the criterion for a critic, in the sense that, does it ever include something where that piece of art may bring something that is of a soulful value to the viewer, for example? And maybe are there any other criterions that might be taken into consideration aside from the fact that the artist also needs to make a living? So the monetary aspect definitely is also an issue, and might there be a conflict between the soul and the material?
I think there's always a conflict between the soul and material. I think I can speak for Art Review only, in that we don't really have a criteria. There are certain issues, maybe bigger issues, that we're interested in. But I'm not going to tell someone who's living in Delhi what they should be reviewing unless I'm in Delhi and seeing the shows. So it's also a collective effort, in the case of a publication, between a lot of people and a lot of different ideas and perspectives on things. And I think what we try to do, at least, is to amass as many different perspectives and ideas as we can, and hope that something coalesces as an entity out of it. Often it doesn't. It is the space of doubt sometimes.
Yeah, the work is about curiosity, and there's always a part of emotion in that.
I think got time for one more question at the back.
Thank you guys for the panel. I have a question that, I mean, recently we've been seeing so many examples of art writing and art criticism produced by artificial intelligence and their language learning models. While I don't believe writing jobs are actually threatened by AI, if these texts are a kind of mirror to what's being produced in the field, I'm curious what you guys see in the reflection.
I think it's clear that the chatbots are going to destroy all of us across fields.
I think there was something like this said about curating, but curators are still here, so let's see, huh?
And I think that I talked about building a public sphere before, and I think it's a little bit tricky or problematic maybe to talk about building a public, like you said, in the age of artificial intelligence or algorithmic platform. But I do think these are questions that I think are still relevant and even urgent to think about. More than the, artificial intelligence or planetary scale grand topics, at least for me as an editor working today here in China.
Maybe just one more at the front, and then.
I would like to ask, how do you see the role of theory in art criticism? For example, philosophical and scientific theories.
So that was, how do we see the role of, sorry, I didn't quite catch it.
The role of theories in the critical.
Theory in the collection.
Philosophy and science.
I mean, I think for me it's intimately connected.
Because I published some articles, but I published, but just to acknowledge the artwork by the science. I think it's not art critical. So I will ask this question.
I mean, there's theory of aesthetics, right? Which is a whole body of work which one may or may not have read a lot of, or one may, in writing that is more, there are spaces for writing that is explicitly more theoretical, right? You're not necessarily going to go into theories of aesthetics when you're writing for a mass market newspaper. Then there's other kinds of theory. I'll just give, my original training is not in art or art history or anything. It's in the social sciences and political economy. And I know a lot about theories of politics and economics. And let me assure you that those play a great amount of role in my writing, but in the background. It's structuring, it's infrastructure of the writing. It's not the superstructure. There's a theoretical term for you.
I mean, I would just add that I think art writing also exists in the context of writing, more generally. And there are intersections with other fields and disciplines. I mean, I'm constantly stealing from science and philosophy, or using that to inform what I do. And I think there's no need to see them as completely separate things. I think they're all part of a bigger conversation. I think that, unfortunately, is the end of our time. I'd like to thank you all for taking time out to come and see us, and especially to thank the very eloquent panel that I've been fortunate to be part of.